Welcome to another exciting, informative edition of New Horizons for America, featuring Dr. Jim Polakof. Here we seek the truth and discover how to improve your well-being. Our new episode focuses upon how to solve today's political division in America. Dr. Jim's special guest, Charles Wheelan, is the founder of Unite America. He lectures at Dartmouth University and wrote several New York Times best-selling books. Now to Dr. Jim.
When I was in high school in a history class, I recall there was one patriotic quote that really rang through. United we stand, divided we fall. Now, Patrick Henry was the first American to use this phrase in 1799, and that was when some fellow countrymen were coming out in favor of states' rights over federal authority. So his actual quote was, "United we stand, divided we fall. Let us not split into factions, which will destroy that union upon which our existence exists." More than ever, our nation is divided. This past election offers not only proof that there's a split among Americans, but the hate which emanates from this division is horrible. I'm highly motivated to seek solutions, to somehow address this fierce split in our country, which is filled with animosity on both sides. My goal in future podcasts is to incorporate a platform for different beliefs and ideas so we can better understand each other. I truly believe that even though we as Americans may not see eye to eye on certain issues, through expanded understanding, can respectfully live with each other face to face. Yes, we can agree to disagree and continue to remain friends. Way back on November 6, 1926, a fellow by the name of Will Rogers made a famous quote. I'll never forget it. "I never met a man I didn't like." Now, during his lifetime, Will Rogers was one of the most popular and beloved men in America. And the reason that Will was so admired is the fact he was able to find good in every person. Perhaps it may be time to return to those good old days when friends could disagree and still be friends. Let's see if through this podcast we can make this happen. Welcome to my podcast, Charles Wheelan. I'm hoping that Unite America can present solutions for our political polarization. So we face this daily, and I really welcome you because I know you're going to have some good advice for us.
Well, I look forward to talking about it. No silver bullets, but there's a way forward, I think.
No silver bullets. All right, we'll keep that in mind. In any case, this past election has clearly demonstrated how divided we are as a country and how angry and hostile people have become simply because they have different viewpoints. Now, what is Unite America doing to bridge this gap and to solve our nation's problems?
Yes, the first thing I'd add to your diagnosis, which I agree with, is fear. There's also a fear out there. And we know from psychology that fear makes everything worse. It creates kind of a scarcity mentality. It turns other groups into enemies instead of collaborators. So we're distrustful, we're fearful, we've lost faith in many of our institutions. And I think the most important thing is we've lost our capacity to self-govern or to do it well. And that's where I'll start, because that's at the heart of the Unite America mission. It's not necessarily that we're going to get along better with our neighbors, that we're going to like other people more. Those are all terrific things. Our mission is, can we, as a diverse country of 330 million people, govern ourselves better? And by better, that means addressing problems that we all know have to be addressed, whether it's infrastructure, the fiscal situation, climate change. We can come up with a long list of things that we're not addressing. The mission, therefore, of Unite America is to change our governance institutions, or in some cases, the incentives presented to the people who are elected, so that they either have more incentive to solve those problems, or that the people we're electing are more amenable to solving those challenges. That's at the heart of what we're trying to do. And then we can kind of get into the specifics.
I want to get into the incentives in just a bit, but I have a sort of a leading question in a sense. what do you see as America's single biggest challenge? Do you think that it's voters who are not open to consider different viewpoints, or politicians who put winning before country?
I think it's the latter. Politicians who put often their party, or their tribe. We've gotten to a point where the parties have become kind of a proxy for a tribe. And I don't mean that as kind of a throwaway bumper sticker analysis. I mean it that what characterizes tribal thinking or religious division, if you go back centuries, is that people have a set of beliefs because those beliefs are shared by their tribe. But then the difference, which is true of ideological beliefs and political parties historically, there's nothing wrong with that. The difference with tribalism is if the tribe changed their view, like yesterday the world was round, today it's flat, then people just go along with it. So in some ways, the tail is wagging the dog. You're doing what the tribe is saying. You're not joining the tribe because they happen to share your beliefs. So
perhaps for some people, politics has replaced religion. They now have a faith in politics, or so to speak.
I think that is really an important observation. I don't know how we would demonstrate that empirically. I've heard a number of very smart people offer that. I certainly see evidence that people treat their politics as a kind of religion. And by that, I mean that things become sacrosanct. It's, lots of people forever have had strong opinions about capital punishment, abortion, taxes. That's all legit. But if I enter into a discussion with you about abortion or marginal tax rates, it's treated more like something that has come down in a holy book. And you get the kind of absolutist views around guns on the right, absolutist views around abortion on the left, on these issues that clearly are not absolutist in nature. So I think that's an important observation.
Oh, good.
And the question is, how does this tribal thinking among the population, which has been encouraged by our fractured media outlets and the like, how does that translate into behavior of politicians? And that, I think, is a place where there's a potential to intercede and maybe change the way that politicians behave.
Right. Theoretically, these people are supposed to be our leaders.
They're supposed to be our leaders. And
they are more followers in terms of public opinion.
Exactly. We have a representative democracy. It is not a pure democracy. We don't, with the exception maybe of California, we don't do most things by referendum. We elect people who we expect will do what's right by us. And implicit in that always, particularly in the drafting of the Constitution, is the notion of compromise. I don't elect somebody so that they will do 100% of what I want. I elect somebody who I feel broadly in touch with, who will compromise in ways that I think are in the best interest of me in the long run.
Well, you're an enlightened American. That's why you can think that way. So I appreciate that. Now, Unite America's stated goals are better incentives, better leadership, and better governance. And one way you go about this is to elect pro-reform candidates. Now, I'm just curious, and this is why I asked this question. Doesn't that sort of get you into the partisan area when you start to back these candidates?
It depends how you define partisan. I mean, I take a somewhat pejorative sense of partisan, which is that I'm going to do things for political advantage, even if they may not be consistent with my ideology or with problem solving. It does get us clearly into politics, because you can't talk about governance without talking about politics. Some people would like to do that. I mean, as if you can talk about having a baby without talking about sex. We find the politics part of it so distasteful, but we love the babies. Yeah. So it does. I think our goal is not to dictate what the political outcomes will be. Our view is, look, on most issues, there's a bell curve of belief, and there's kind of a sweet spot in the middle of that bell curve, whether it's even on issues like guns and abortion. You're not going to get to 100% agreement, but you can get to 60% on a lot of stuff. And our view is, in the absence of getting to that 60%, which usually means doing nothing in the face of serious problems, that's a harm. So what can we do to make the political system, as it has done for centuries, kind of move toward solutions that are amenable to that center, that fat part of the bell curve?
So we're going to get into reform in a minute, but again, just staying with this topic, you find a candidate that you feel not espouses the ideas that they're going to put, obviously, country over political gain, so to speak. My question is, again, How do you go about choosing these candidates without becoming somewhat partisan? I mean, I'm assuming you were choosing Democrats as well as Republicans. In some cases, there are very few independents, so you're either choosing Democrats or Republicans. How do you go about this?
Well, the first thing we do is focus on process reform. So we change the way ideally, we change the way elections are held.
And we're going to get into that.
Yeah. And so I think it's an answer to this question, which is if we'll talk about ranked choice voting, I know, but we want to implement ranked choice voting, which will favor Republicans in some cases, it will favor Democrats in other cases, but in all cases, it will disfavor those who have a ceiling on their support. So I think that's an example of a reform that changes the incentives, but it's really agnostic to the underlying politics, other than hopefully electing people who have more of an incentive to make compromises and solve problems. The same is true with other kinds of primary reforms. We've done a lot of, this is where I will dally in bumper stickers, talking about the primary problem, the play on the word primary, but our thinking is that as gerrymandering has become more specific and we've become better at doing it, there are a high number of districts, red and blue,
right,
that are entirely safe in the general election, which means that the primary election determines the winner. I ran in one of those districts. It was the 5th district in Illinois, covered Chicago and some of the suburbs. It had been ruthlessly gerrymandered when Dan Rostenkowski held that seat. That name will ring a bell.
Yes, it does.
Long-serving chair of Ways and Means, spent a little time in prison.
Well, I think that's what we last remember about him.
Yeah.
Being behind open bars. But anyway.
Yeah, he came back. I was living in Chicago. He got out of prison and he was still a hero to many, which says a lot about Chicago politics. But our thought is, to the extent that we can push back on gerrymandering, which again would be by referendum or other process changes that make the districts more competitive, then it's more likely that the winner is determined in the general election, not the primary. And to connect the dots.
I think that's important. So let's get into reform campaigns.
Sure.
We'll begin with ranked choice voting, as you had mentioned previously, and I know that's an important issue with you, and it should be. So Alaska did it in 2020 on a ballot measure that was designed to increase voter participation while reducing that negative effect of partisanship. So can you explain that concept to us? And also, what did Unite America do? What role did you play in helping to make this happen in Alaska?
Sure. Let's start with what ranked choice voting is. I need to be better always at explaining it. It's one of these things that's really easy once you've done it, a little harder to explain a concept. But the high level idea here is that if I say, James, I'm going to the supermarket to buy Ben and Jerry's ice cream, what do you want? And you say Americone Dream. And I say, all right, well, if they're out, what do you want? You say mint chip. Basically, you've got a first choice, and if you don't get your first choice, I'm going to give you your second choice. This is what we do all the time in life. So let's go to elections in its purest form, which Alaska just passed, and in this cycle, Nevada passed. They will have to pass it again in 2 years to make it operational. You would get rid of the partisan primaries. So just kind of blow up that way of thinking about elections. So Team Red and Team Blue no longer pick their candidates separately. In the case of Nevada, independents were not allowed to vote in that primary. So you've got a small partisan group picking the candidates that appear on the general election ballot. So Alaska gets rid of that and goes to something that looks more like a school council election, which says all the candidates run in the first round, and the top 4 will advance to the runoff election.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's very familiar to everybody. There can be 18 candidates. I think in the race that Sarah Palin ran in, there were maybe 26, including somebody named Santa Claus, who didn't make, to the surprise of many,
it wasn't close enough to Christmas. That's why.
It did not, maybe, I don't know, did not make the general election. So the top 4 could be 5. That's just a design feature. In Alaska, the top 4 go onto the general election ballot. You walk in and you say, okay, here's my top choice. Sarah Palin or Mary Peltola, what have you. Just looks like every kind of voting. But then the difference is you say, all right, if that person doesn't get 50% on the first ballot, here's my second choice.
And this gives your nonpartisan voter a better opportunity to participate, absolutely. Correct? That's the real key. 40% of America is almost nonpartisan.
One of its most important features is that smaller party candidates or independents no longer would play a spoiler role. If we think back, anybody old enough to remember the role that Ralph Nader played in 2000 in Florida, or perhaps when George H.W. Bush was running against Perot,
Right.
where these candidates who aren't going to win siphon enough votes from the most similar candidate and inadvertently elect somebody who the people who supported Nader really don't want. So that goes away for reasons that'll be clear when we talk more about ranked choice voting. So you rank your candidates. If one of the four gets 50%, we're done. The whole point here is that anybody who wins will ultimately have support of 50% of the electorate.
The majority.
If that doesn't happen, as we saw in Alaska in the congressional race, then whoever's in last place, the fourth candidate, is eliminated. And everybody who chose that person as their first choice now gets their second choice. And that second choice is allocated among the remaining three candidates. And you do it again. If now somebody has 50%, and usually if you just have to do this once, then that person wins. So they are the first choice of a lot of people and the second choice of an additional group, but they are a choice of 50% or more of the state. And you kind of
It's almost like you have a general election where everyone can participate rather than a primary that is closed to just whatever your partisan registration is.
I think that's exactly right. I don't think we fully appreciate how weird primary elections are. When I talk about it, I say to people, imagine a student council election where the football team nominates one candidate for the general election ballot and the band nominates the other. So you got these two rarefied non-representative groups, and then the other 2,000 students in the school vote on these choices that have been put up there by groups that are not representative of them. That's really what the primaries do. In most primaries, you've got 8 or 10% of the electorate putting up that candidate, and the other 90% have no say.
So voters did it again in Nevada. Until now, Nevada had closed primaries. And so what happened there? Was Unite America involved? I mean, how do you, as an organization, get involved in these reform campaigns?
We get involved in a lot of different ways. We were very involved in Alaska. We were very involved in Nevada. We do it in a number of ways. One is we've got I would describe it as kind of a venture capital model or a private equity model where we call them actually investors or political philanthropists. They're people who are very concerned about the state of politics. They don't necessarily know what to do or where to have the most impact. What we do as an organization is we keep tabs on legislative and referendum-based challenges or changes around the country. And we go to our investors and say, if you invest in the Unite America Fund, then we know there's a good chance that this Alaska referendum may pass. Nevada looks good. Here's another state where they've got on the ballot, but the language is bad. We don't think it can win. We're not going to do that. So we channel resources from people who are very concerned about reform to those states where there is a good chance of passing some impactful change.
So do you do it through, do you promote this through commercials, through a groundswell or a ground game or a combination of things?
A combination of things. So campaign finance is so arcane. We do it in some cases by funding local initiatives, and they will then in turn run the campaigns. We collaborate aggressively with other groups. So Catherine Gale, you may be familiar with, is running a Final Five organization that's promoting ranked choice around the country. We work closely with her. So it's like any real good campaign. It is being part of a coalition, and in some cases leading the coalition, that will bring all of those resources to bear on the ballot initiative.
Well, that makes sense. So you had mentioned it earlier, and one of my pet peeves is gerrymandering. And of course, we know the evil of gerrymandering. But in your opinion, what can we do to change this around? Do we have to depend upon courts where judges are obviously picked by political parties or candidates? Or is there another answer that Unite America has come up with as far as gerrymandering?
There's no, I said at the outset, I'll keep repeating, there's no silver bullet here. In this case, there is no perfect system for picking districts. There's always going to be some human element, although having said that, there is software now that will draw your districts, and it's pretty good. I mean, if you think about it, the true objective should be the most compact districts that respect geographic and municipal boundaries. If you want to have Chicago as a district and the suburbs as a district and downstate district, and not these districts that look like cancers with tentacles that stretch out 200 miles to grab
Exactly.
we kind of, it's like pornography. We know what a terribly gerrymandered district looks like. We just don't necessarily have a mechanism for getting rid of it. That said, there are a number of ways to go at it. Some states have done independent redistricting commissions where you can have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and independent. Some people have done it with panels of judges. So that you can choose, depending on your state constitution, what have you, what the mechanism is. I would argue that most of them are an improvement on having one political party or the other, whoever controls the state legislature, draw boundaries that are clearly not designed to be compact and representative of some particular group.
Yeah,
And
that's
more-
how it is in many of the swing states, though.
yes,
You
it
really
is.
have it controlled politically as
Oh,
opposed
absolutely. And
to democratically.
there are 2 symptoms that your districts have been terribly gerrymandered. One is they just don't look like anything. I've got a slide of a Maryland district, that started out maybe 30 years ago as more or less compact. There are little things sticking out and so on. Usually those are rivers and neighborhoods and so on. And then over the years, it just kind of grows into this kind of nerve-like cell. So that's your first symptom, is this doesn't look like a district that a sane person would draw. And then the second one is the pernicious consequence, which is you start to get outcomes legislatively that are not representative of the state. So if you're a place like Pennsylvania or North Carolina, where it's pretty evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, depending on who narrowly controls the legislature, you might have congressional districts that are 4-1 favoring one party or the other, even though the state is evenly divided. That's the other symptom. Sadly, that's a sign that you've done a really good job of gerrymandering. You've kind of put all the reds or all the blues in one place. But again, we need to keep coming back to why this is so damaging. It's that you now have representatives who are not truly representative of the people that they're supposed to be representing.
Well, and you mentioned North Carolina, which is an excellent example, simply because it took the judiciary to step in to actually change that around. It was an absolutely overwhelming gerrymandering done by the state legislature in North Carolina. So here again, the judiciary stepped in, but with the appointment of judges and election of judges and all of these things that have become so political, people have got to stand up against it to be able to have a fair choice in elections.
They do. And I was disappointed. I'm not a legal scholar, so I can't speak to the merits of it. I was disappointed that the Supreme Court did not kind of lay down the law and say, look, you can't be doing things at the state level that clearly disenfranchise people by virtue of how you're drawing the lines and the representation. And so I understand that there's wide deference to the states, but it certainly doesn't feel like it's in the spirit of the system that we've designed.
So now moving to another subject, many states have placed an emphasis upon, more restrictions on voting from home. How do you feel about that? And does Unite America get involved in finding a formula, shall we say, where people can vote at home? Is there a measure that you're pushing that is doing that in different states?
We do. We haven't been terribly active, but we are supportive of vote at home measures because there are ways we believe that it can be done safely and securely. And if we all kind of collaborate, you can do banking at home. If you can do banking at home, you can probably do voting at home, recognizing that there are real threats and everything else. So you want to be able to build in safeguards. We're very encouraged by what Colorado has done. They were a leader. There's a woman, I forget her name, Amber something, who has kind of been a leader in the vote at home movement. She was the Secretary of State in Colorado. She's now started a nonprofit organization to bring that expertise to other states. So our sense, I'm not an expert on the details, but our sense is that you can design a system, as we have for other kinds of things, with scanners and computer verification and other kinds of things that would make it. We know that early voting has been very popular. We stand to reason that vote at home would also be very popular. Anything to our minds that makes it easier for people to vote while still being secure gets back to this idea of having more representative elections. Ideally, we want as many people as possible to be able to weigh in, and we do believe that the technology should make that possible.
So now, in terms of, and I'm curious about this, where does Unite America find the substantial amount of money that you need to reform these campaigns? Charlie, do you have deep pockets? Is that where it's coming
I don't
from?
have deep pockets. I can buy a lot of books. You can see that from behind me. I do not have deep pockets. But a lot of people do have deep pockets. And, I've spent a lot of my time reaching into those pockets, I will tell you. We have been arguing with increased success for a term I may have coined it. I can't say that. I certainly embraced it if I saw it early, but I now use it frequently. The term is political philanthropy, which is not usually the way people think of political giving. Usually an election comes around, they like one candidate, they dislike the others, they give a tremendous amount, billions and billions per cycle. If you look at the amount of money spent in the midterms, it's crazy. And then somebody wins and it's all over. Our thinking is that 150 years ago, people of enormous means built college campuses, they built parks, Central Park, they built libraries. These are things that will continue giving for hundreds of more years. They're remarkable contributions. Well, the pitch we're making right now is if you are a person of serious means, we don't necessarily need more college campuses. We don't necessarily need more galleries. We need political reform. So if you want to make the world better for your great-grandchildren, invest in institutional change, not a particular candidate, but institutional change.
That makes sense.
That will protect the system and make it work better. And that argument has landed quite well. We've been lucky to have some very serious donors who are really altruistic and committed to that 150 year horizon.
Well, I think that's good news. So one of the other questions that leads into this is obviously campaign finance reform, where, there are these extravagant amounts of money that must be spent on an election in order to elect a candidate. And it's overwhelming. And of course, people are disturbed by all these political ads that come along with it that you can hardly wait till the election is over just to get rid of the ads.
Right. No, I think you would pay money to get rid of the ads.
I think I would invest in that. Yes. But so Unite America, do you have a stand? Do you have a particular position, or are you doing something specific in terms of campaign finance?
We're not, for two reasons. One bigger than the other. There are other groups working on it. And one of the things, the political reform space is so fragmented that we're trying to prevent overlap and focusing kind of on our lane. But that's really kind of a cop-out for the bigger reason, which is I personally, and we, the organization, cannot figure out what the right approach here is. I believe strenuously that it's a huge problem. Everything that you've read about money in politics, I will take and I will raise because I've run as a candidate. And I'll just tell you one story. So just to put it in context, I was running in a special election in Chicago. It was not a terribly expensive race because it was very crowded. There were a number of candidates. It was a special election. There were 20-some people. Most people were not doing broadcast television ads, in part because there was no negative advertising. Nobody even knew what the front runner was. So having prefaced it with that, it was still, I had to raise something on the order of $5,000 to $7,000 a day, just to that's what we're spending. That's the run rate.
And that's without doing TV ads.
That's without doing TV. That's right. Your computers, that's your paid staff, we're doing a lot of mail. Mail is surprisingly effective. Yeah, that's without doing some cable ads, but you still have to pay people to make those ads. So call it $6,000 a day. And that's not terribly hard for the first 40 days, but there are hard spending limits. So you can't go back to the same donor. So you wake up on day 41 having exhausted all the easy money and even the reasonably hard money, and you need $6,000. And if you don't find it, it's coming out of your pocket because you've committed to spend that. And if you have a couple bad days, now you're $24,000 in the hole. And that's coming out of my pocket. My kids hadn't gone to college yet. One more bad day. Now you're $30,000.
Now you're digging into your deep pockets. All right.
Yeah. Right. So
write another book.
So imagine that scenario. You show up, at probably late 9:30, 10 in the office because you've been out on a cold L platform, shaking hands and gathering signatures. So now you're really cold. It's 10 o'clock in the morning and you got a few hours to raise $6,000. And you get an inbound call from the Trial Lawyers Association. And I think they may have rebranded themselves, but they're basically the personal injury attorney. And the guy says, we'd like to do an event for you. And we think we can fill the room and we can probably raise $60,000 or $80,000 at one event. And in my mind, I'm thinking 10 days, 10 days of like water and food. And you say, all right, well, let's talk about dates and what have you. And then he says, we just have one question. What is your view of medical malpractice reform? Now, mind you, I teach public policy by day.
Right,
the U.S. system for malpractice is among the most broken in the world. And I've had students do presentations, and I could give you probably 4 systems, all of which would work better. We could have medically qualified judges, we could have court-appointed expert witnesses, we could have a no contest compensation. We could do 6 or 8 things that would all be better. We could pull out of a hat. They'd all be better than what we're doing now. So I say, well, I think there's a lot of room for improvement. At which point they say, I don't think we can do the event because they don't want improvement. They want to be able to continue to sue on a contingency basis in the courts. And there your $60,000 goes away. But if it doesn't, then you get elected and you've just closed the door on malpractice reform. And if you imagine this as just slowly closing the door on whatever needs to be done, how do you feel about, cracking down on methane leaks? I think it's important. Well, I'm sorry, the Fracking Association can't get behind you. Then you arrive in Congress having made pledges that compromise your ability to get stuff done on this issue.
Yes, and that is the nature of political campaigns, being beholden to someone else.
Yeah. But back to your question, every time we've tried to do something legislatively, we've kind of closed the door and opened a window, and the money just seems to come in the window. Right. Obviously, Citizens United makes it very hard. I got to be honest, I'm not excited about a world in which the government can crack down on political spending. Yes, I don't like everything we've just described, but imagine a very partisan federal government that now it's just, you and I are protesting against it, and now they pass a law that makes it hard for us to do what we want to do. The
First a double-edged sword is what it is.
Yeah, the First Amendment was the first one.
Right.
So, and I'm not real keen to open the hood on the Constitution in this very partisan environment. It's an imperfect document, but there are a lot of worse Constitution ideas out there. So I don't, it's a very long answer for your very good question, which is, what do we do about all this money? And I don't know.
Well, hopefully we can arrive at something, because I think most Americans are disturbed about how much is being spent. My God, how much could be used for good causes with all
anything,
feeding America, all of the hungry people and the homeless people. I mean, there are so many things you could do with that money rather than jam the airways with ads and just, people just run for their refrigerators at that point in time. It's amazing. Right. But anyway, that's my soapbox. I'm curious, you talked about yourself personally. You lecture at Dartmouth. You're an author of several best-selling books, including Naked Economics, Naked Statistics, Naked Money. It almost sounds like a cover-up, but that's a pretty bad pun. But seriously, I'm curious, where do you find time for your demanding role in Unite America?
Well, you have to kind of squeeze it in. The theme throughout my career is I've always gone where my interests have taken me. I started as I got my PhD in public policy. That's always been my core interest, is I'm somebody who comes back to governance. Happy day for me is sitting around talking about budget, deficit reduction techniques with a bunch of other policy wonks. So I got into the political arena in part because I saw that our capacity to deal with these real issues was being eroded. Meanwhile, I started writing the Naked books because, having studied public policy and economics, I was asked to teach a course for journalists at Medill, the journalism school at Northwestern. I assumed there was a book on economics that discarded all the useless math and the hard to understand graphs and just focused on the ideas that mattered. So I was trying to write a book on the gambling industry at the time. I called my agent and said, look, publishing better than I. where do I find this book on economics that will teach these journalists the important ideas without boring them to death? She said, well, I don't think there is one, but you're going to write it.
So you wrote a book for lay people, in essence.
I did, for my mother. As I was writing it, my mother was always the audience, smart, but not necessarily informed in economics. And then, of course, that gave birth to the others. But Unite America grew out of a book called The Centrist Manifesto that was kind of a cri de coeur about the state of our politics. And then the Centrist Manifesto led to the founding of Unite America. And to be honest, it was in the early days when I was running it and doing a day job and trying to write, it was tough. Now, in part because of the fundraising we talked about earlier, it's big enough that we have a staff of 17 or 18, and I can go back to being a board member, which is in a more appropriate role for somebody with a day job.
Oh, well, that makes a lot of sense, but you are cramming a lot in there. So in any case, and as we sort of conclude this, because I guess we're at that point, my main interest, frankly, personally, is bringing people together because we have such a divided country. Do you have any final thoughts on that?
I do. I think it turns out, and I've looked into the social science research, the psychology research, that trust and deep relationships have to come first. And if you've ever had an experience with somebody who you really like and respect, who has different views, and hopefully that's lots of people because the world has a lot of interesting different people, it's much easier to talk about those issues from a place of trust and respect, which is, I understand your backstory, I understand your faith or lack of faith or what, and I'm not worried that if I say something that might be perceived as offensive, you're going to tweet it out and I'm going to get attacked. It's just and so those discussions can be a lot of fun. They can be enlightening. They can change your view because you know that somebody's got these honestly held beliefs and you start to understand where they're coming from. But it's really absent that trust and affection, which, by the way, I think used to characterize a lot of members of Congress. When you talk to the old generation, the people who served 30 and 40 years ago in the Tip O'Neill era, when Tip O'Neill and Reagan would argue by day and share a scotch at the end of the day, that was a different world. That was pre-social media and so on. That I think the key here is to build relationships. And there are a lot of things working against that. We're all turning on different news channels. We're all getting different feeds in our social media. Things are pushing us apart as humans. We're more, residential segregation by race is diminished. But what we're losing sight of is that segregation by socioeconomic status, we're more segregated than ever before. You live around people who share your education, your income, and often your political beliefs. So I think the key here is to start rebuilding our human relationships. And then the partisanship, it's always going to be there, but that's a healthy thing. But the unhealthy feature of partisanship will start to take care of itself.
Well, as I said in my introduction, and I quote that, I think we really need to start listening to each other. And with the animosity, it makes it very difficult because we are so divided and opposed to each other's ideas that we might want to support. In my introduction, I mentioned a quote from a man who was before our time, but you know the name, Will Rogers. And his famous quote was, "I never met a man I didn't like." And I have a feeling that, there are ways to agree to disagree and listen to each other and read an accommodation. Somehow I think we've got to get there.
We do. And I think creating common purpose is a step in the right direction. When you hear about people who've served in combat, who've worked together on some shared objective with people who are very different, come from different backgrounds, the fact that they're working together towards some higher purpose often helps to bring them together in a way that we're lacking right now.
Well, we all have things in common. There's something you can find in common with everyone you know, even though you may disagree on most things. That one thing in common can open the conversation, and then you perhaps start to listen to each other. But anyway, that's another one of my soapboxes. I want to thank you, Charles Wheelan, for sharing such valuable input with us. It's been extremely interesting. I'm going to encourage my listeners and viewers as well to definitely go to uniteamerica.com. We're going to have information on our website because most of our listeners and watchers actually go to our website for information. So we're going to have links that you're going to share with us, and also a way to get to your website and a way to support your organization.
Yes, so
Because
uniteamerica.org. I'm not sure what happens if you go to .com. They might be like
the .org, and I'm sorry about the .com, but you're absolutely right. United America or uniteamerica.org. So, but we're definitely going to have that on our website. And I want to thank you because you've been very enlightening. It's been a great discussion.
Well, it's obviously something I care deeply about, and I appreciate your interest in this really important topic.
And I appreciate your passion.
You can access more interesting and informative information about Unite America and other valuable resources on our website, jamespolakof.com. Plus, you'll find many other great podcasts. And keep your comments coming. It helps us understand what you want and need. Again, our website is jamespolakof.com. That's James, Polakof.com. Now back to Dr. Jim for his additional comments.
I've researched Unite America, and I really have found this to be an organization that deserves our support. So if you share my thoughts, my feelings, that I'm tired of this political division, I'm tired of hearing these political ads that dominate our television sets during elections. I'm really tired about the division that happens in our country because I don't see a real reason for it. I think we have common ground. So if you believe or you share these beliefs, then I suggest you take action. Let's give some serious consideration to becoming involved with Unite America. Again, their contact information, uniteamerica.org. Their website will be found on our website, as well as links to some very important issues. So you definitely want to check out our website. And also, as our production coordinator, Faith Michelle, stated, our website also has some great podcasts that you may have not heard on platforms such as Spotify, iHeart, Apple, or seen, of course, through YouTube. So why not tune into some of those? You might find them to be very interesting as well. In any case, I also want your feedback as to what you're interested in and what we can do to make this podcast better. This is Dr. Jim Polakof, and I thank you for joining me once again. Remember, you can listen and watch one of our episodes every week. They're designed for the seekers of truth and, of course, your well-being. Thank you.